Well, welcome to the debate on neoliberalism versus libertarianism. These terms are kind of difficult to sparse out, but I've thought about it a lot, so this is going to be my best distinction. I think libertarianism is the ever-present resistance to government, the ever resistance to some sort of authority that keeps you from doing what you want to do, versus neoliberalism, while also being born from the at-large liberalism movement, is more of a consequentialism that acknowledges markets can make people better off, but making people better off is the ultimate goal. And if that involves some level of coercion, if that involves some level of government intervention, neoliberalism can endorse such motives as long as people are generally better off. And that brings a lot of questions to mind on how we go forward with policy, because I don't think anyone is 100% libertarian or 100% anarchist, except for the few anarchists here. Well,
except for me.
Except for Spike, which is why he's here. But yeah, so Spike Cohen, you guys all know who he is. Ran for vice president for the Libertarian Party. Very excited to have him here. And then we also have the podcaster formerly known as Bastiat. Warren Rhea is also with us, who's...
you need a symbol for
the artist formerly known. I love the reference. I also won a very contentious Twitter poll for Chief Neoliberal Shill, and by day I work as a corporate attorney in the natural gas business. So good to be here. Thank you.
Yes, so I'm going to just bring up general topics that I think both sides diverge on. We're having a nice little discussion, and I'm going to try to make it as heated as possible, but we are among friends, so I'll probably stay relatively cool. So yeah, I think when you guys first debated, you guys talked about inflation first.
Yes.
But I think we're going to save that for the end.
Okay,
if
good.
we can even get to that, to be completely honest.
All right, okay.
I think where we should start is actually the welfare state.
Oh, wow, okay.
Because libertarians often have this idea that the welfare state would operate better without the government. And I'm just curious, Spike, is that what your position is, or is it more of a moral position of you can't force someone to give their goods to someone else, even if there's like an overall broad society benefit? Like what's like the motivation behind being against the government-provided welfare state in all circumstances, or maybe limited circumstances?
Sure. So first, I'm going to give the same caveat that I gave at the last debate I was in. I hurt my back, so if you see me suddenly wince, it's not necessarily because of something that Warren said. Also, I am on a little bit of pain medication for the pain, so if you liked Spike Cohen, you'll love Spike Cohen on drugs. With that said, I think I'd word it differently, because to say the welfare state would do better without the government is like the ads that they had a few years ago that said, keep big government out of your Medicare. So I wouldn't say welfare state. I would say that if you look at poverty as what it is, as the problem that it is, the best way to deal with poverty, if you're looking at a system where the government is largely either creating or worsening poverty among a lot of people, you get rid of that first before you have any discussion. If you were a doctor and someone came to you and said, "Doc, I've got this real bad pain in my arm," and you looked and noticed that someone was stabbing them in the arm, long before you started thinking of how you would fix the wound there, you would stop the stabbing from happening. So if we look at things like, and I imagine Warren and I are largely going to agree on this point, maybe not, that if we look at things like occupational licensing, if we look at things like taxation, if we look at things like the Federal Reserve creating money out of thin air and devaluing everyone's currency, causing this rampant cost of living increase due to monetary inflation, which disproportionately hurts those with the least amount of that currency to begin with. If we look at overregulation, which is expressly and explicitly designed to protect the existing providers and existing businesses in a given sector at the expense of any new entrepreneurs or the working poor who want to work their way up the ladder, creating a barrier to entry. If you look at all of the things that either create poverty or make poverty worse, then I think we hopefully are largely in agreement that all that should be off the table. If we think of the welfare state, or really any assistance for people, as a safety net, and we look at the ladders out of that safety net with all of the bottom rungs removed, then I think the first step is put those rungs back so enough people who are able to climb out themselves can do so and help others on their way up. For those who can't help themselves, for a variety of reasons, I think that once we have reduced the amount of poverty and returned poverty to being either a temporary thing or something that is only permanently affecting a small minority of people, now we can look at things like charity and mutual aid as a way of addressing those issues. But I think that our number one concern, and I say this as an anarcho-capitalist, I don't talk a lot about saying we need to be cutting off people's welfare checks. I talk a lot about removing the harms that are putting them in a position where they have to rely on welfare checks and on free food programs and on public housing. I've yet to meet anyone who actually wants to live in a housing project. And I've been to housing projects. I've done door-knocking tours in housing projects, and I can tell you right now, no one there was like, man, I really love this housing project. It's terrible, and a lot of the stuff doesn't work, and it's not very safe here, but I don't have to pay anything. No one is saying that. What they're saying is, I don't want the police to stop me every time that I try to start a business because I can't afford the licensing, and they take all my money with civil asset forfeiture, and I can't even fight to get it back, even though they couldn't prove I committed a crime, and I'm stuck here. I heard that many times. They didn't even know necessarily the term occupational licensing, but they knew they wanted to get out of this and that they weren't being allowed to. So I think that should be our main focus on that. And once we've done that, then this is a question that I think most of us would agree could be handled through charity and mutual aid and things like that.
Okay, well, let me be very specific about a specific type of policy proposal. I'm sure many in this room are familiar with Milton Friedman. He basically...
I know where you're going.
Yeah. So he basically had this idea where all types of transfers, whether they're for healthcare products, whether they're for food, we shouldn't really divvy them up as those types of products as housing. We should just do the cash equivalent of those and use a negative income tax to send those to people individually. In the broad scheme of things, do you oppose that type of approach? In your perfect society, assume we have a perfect society and all the issues you just brought up are actually taken care of.
Yeah.
Would you actually be against that type of approach, even if it's lower on your priorities of things that we would be doing? Where do you fall on that, ultimately in the perfect society?
Yeah, so while it may be better than our current system, although I'm not sure it would be, I would still oppose it. I'm a huge fan of Milton Friedman. Free to Choose was a big part of, watching those was a big part of my transition away from being a terrible neocon to being a Super Saiyan final form libertarian that I am now. At the point where I have nothing else to learn because I've reached perfect libertarianism. You'll all get there at some point, I'm sure. At that, please don't applaud that. At that, the two things that I disagree with Milton Friedman on, one of them he disagrees with himself. It was actually Milton Friedman who came up with the idea of withholding people's income for the income tax program. And he, in retrospect, he said that was one of the most terrible things because the majority of people don't actually feel taxes. They don't actually, they see taxes as something they get back on April 15th. They don't feel that pain of losing that money along the way because it's taken from them before they ever get it. The other thing I disagree with him on is his kind of pre-UBI idea of a negative income tax. Now, here's the problem, the core problem. We could go into many different things, but we don't have the time. The big thing that happens with something like a negative income tax is it creates a very easy way for politicians, I'm a politician, for politicians to get your vote by ever increasing that payout. You now end up with a system whereby if you've eliminated all other forms of welfare and assistance, then the government essentially becomes a payout mechanism where people who are making a certain amount of money and above that are paying for the people at the lower end of the economic spectrum to be given money, more money depending on the less money they make, because the idea of a negative income tax is it's progressively higher in this direction and progressively negative in this direction. So you get more money the less money you have. The obvious problem there is then I can show up and say, hey, I'm Spike Cohen. And currently, the lowest negative income rate is negative 25% or whatever X amount of money that you get per month. And if you vote for me, instead of it being, let's say, $2,000 a month, I'm going to make it $2,500 a month because I care about you. And then Warren shows up and goes, this guy doesn't care about the poor. If you vote for me, Warren, it's Ray or Rhea?
Ray.
Right. If Warren Ray, you might have known me as Bastiat, but now you know me as the guy who's going to give you $3,500 a month. And I go, you SOB, I'll give you $4,000 a month or something. Or
I actually meant 4,000 though. So there you go.
So we'll go straight in on that. Well, you know what? You don't care about the poor. I'll give you $5,000 a month. And the problem is the way this is funded, because we know our government is not funded through taxation. Taxation is what props up our currency. Our government is funded from the Federal Reserve printing out endless trillions of notes to lend to the Treasury, who then pays it back slowly over time through the Treasury bonds. So not only is that creating future debt for generations that haven't even been born yet, people that are going to be born knowing that, once they're able to conceptualize such a thing, knowing that they are paying taxes with interest on stuff that happened years and decades ago, but right now we get to suffer from the cost of living increases that happen as a direct result of the monetary inflation. When you have more money chasing the same number of goods and services, you get less, you get more cost for those goods and services.
So you're obviously against it.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. And that's the distinction I wanted to make here. Because, Warren, I haven't talked to you specifically about this, but I think there is a libertarian-friendly idea of increasing the greater good that a neoliberal may approach.
Well,
so where would you fall on this type of approach, like just welfare in general? Does the government actually have a role for making sure people who are at the bottom can come up?
Yeah, I think it does as a matter of necessity. I would quibble on one point. You mentioned neoliberal more consequentially based. I would say that there's more of a consideration for consequentialism, but I feel like personally, I don't view consequences as a source of morality. I view them more like a necessary consideration if you want to maintain any freedom whatsoever. If I view freedom as my North Star, I must necessarily think about the consequences of policy so that I can maintain as much freedom as possible. I don't think that makes me a consequentialist, really, but these lines kind of blur. So I wanted to mention that as a potential distinction.
I think that's a great
I think your main point, though, is still basically accurate, that we're more, I think, interested in consequences as a consideration.
Yeah,
So
I think there's specific things that the neoliberals have identified as being very important. I don't know who that is.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
So there's they have a preference for certain things being maximized, and then they become very consequential within those.
Yeah,
like wealth.
Yeah, I'd say some of them certainly are. I would just say that for my part, I
okay, fair enough.
Now, on to welfare more generally, I would say that I appreciate you mentioning Free to Choose, because I feel like that for me, especially the miniseries you recorded in the 1980s, which is up on YouTube and very much worth checking into. PBS apparently only did it because they felt they were obligated to do it after doing a big series on Keynes. And so they were not so happy about it. But
I don't see those videos on YouTube.
It was, yeah, they're up there somewhere.
Are they there?
Free to Choose was just a monumental success. The 80s version is the best one.
Yeah.
Very worth checking out. But I suppose I take them in a different direction. I tend to think of Milton Friedman's work, I'd say holistically, and it starts for me with his essay in 1952 called Neoliberalism and Its Prospects. And one of the things he drives home is that he believes, as I believe, that government has an important role to play in the provision of, rather the alleviation of what he called acute misery and distress. Because he pointed out, hey, private charity will cover some part of that. Private charity will never cover all of that. And it's my opinion that our history in the Anglo-American tradition has shown, from the poor laws in England to our local and state provisions for welfare prior to the federal welfare state in the second half of the 20th century, that the public has traditionally viewed the government as having an important role to play in the provision of basic assistance at the end of the day, because people do not like to see poverty. It makes them feel bad, but they also don't necessarily want to make the decision to spend themselves on it. And so there's this third-party effect, sort of, that Milton Friedman describes in this essay, where he says, look, we all feel a cost from poverty. We all feel a benefit from its alleviation. The cost of alleviating that benefit is not spread evenly, and so therefore, for some of the same reasons we might want to treat pollution uniquely, given that it has third-party harms that are not always easily addressed, poverty is something that also has third-party harms. We want to alleviate it through some kind of basic government program. He and Hayek, in his book, The Road to Serfdom, makes an important point, that there are two kinds of government programs, I would argue. There are government programs that are fundamentally distortionary of markets, which are, as a good neoliberal, I think, are very important for the functioning of a free society, the prosperity of a free society, a free functioning market. There are government programs that inherently, by their very nature, drastically distort markets. All right, and I would argue, for example, that the welfare programs, as they were initially designed, that had all kinds of effects that were rooted in, for example, family and life decisions, marriage decisions, things like that. Programs that were somewhat reformed in the 1980s and 90s on the welfare reform programs that punished people for working. Some would argue they still do, but it's different now. That's a fundamentally different thing from the notion of, say, a cash transfer that is not otherwise changing or impacting your life decisions, requiring you to drain your bank account before you get it, for example, to sell off your children's bonds in order to qualify, things like that. As I think Hayek put it, there's a quantifiable and important distinction between central planning, which he views as the real enemy of a free society, and government, quote, ensuring risks. Health insurance, for example, versus some kind of nationalized health insurance program by which you only get your health care from the government. These are distinctions that are important, I think, to recognize kind of from our neoliberal point of view, because one of these can drastically threaten our freedom, as I think the history of the 20th century has shown. Central planning can destroy countries. I mean, I've talked to some wonderful folks here from India who told me about the legacy of central planning in their countries and how the economists at the time of the more, Friedman tradition, warned what would happen, and sure enough, it all came to pass. And then as India has switched away from central planning, it hasn't done away with government entirely, but it has been able to see much better growth that people previously thought, oh, there's just something wrong with India. No, there's something wrong with, with the economic system. We're all people at the end of the day. So to get back to welfare, I think Spike made an interesting point I would agree with about issues like occupational licensing. Well, I might not get rid of all of it. I think that most of it is probably bad. And I think that most of it is a form of insidious state-to-state protectionism. It's mostly state-based.
Correct.
At least in the United States. However, it is also worth noting that this same protectionism has also tragically been with us for a long time, and reaching all the way back to the medieval guilds. The idea that the public's safety depends on restricting production in certain ways so that only qualified people deliver the services that we need. Sometimes there's something to it.
I think both sides probably broadly agree on licensing, right?
I think there's an important. The reason I mention this is that occupational licensing, while I want to get rid of it and restrict it in real ways, is also a fact of life, as are, for example, states themselves. And to say, as I think you were saying, that look, the first thing I would do is get rid of get rid of these bad things and make the problem worse. I agree. That would be how I would start if I were, designing society from the start. But the bleeding, to use your analogy, poverty is a real problem today. And if you are of the opinion that it is not something that is solely the result of government, even though government, I would argue, exacerbates it. I mean, poverty is something that, for the reasons these other, I think, great thinkers have articulated, is something that is a part of life for some people for reasons that go beyond government, and which the public wants to alleviate. And really, I think when it comes to thinking about how we make policy in a liberal democracy, I think we typically have two options. One, we can, I think, try and shoot for perfection and oftentimes suffer for going beyond what the public wants. And in that process, I think we do a free society disservice. Because, for example, when California, for example, a tragic example, drastically deregulated its electricity industry in such a way that not only was it open to competition, but there was so little state oversight that companies were able to come in and exploit the regulatory system in such a way as to give the idea of competitive markets a bad name. I've spent a lot of my career dealing with these kinds of arguments, as somebody who argues for competitive energy supply. And because they went so far, they went far beyond what the public wanted, and they set it up in a bad way. They ended up, for a time, creating the freest energy market in the country. But the snapback, when people had to deal with some of the immediate consequences of higher power prices in the short term, for example, was such that the entire project was undone, and government regulation was, for a time, tighter than ever. And so I think when we say, well, we've got to focus on our ideals rather than kind of what the public wants, I think we get sometimes disaster. I mean, I think a huge difference between, and this is important, because I think we went on for a while here. I think it's important here to say that I'm not talking about a perfect society. We want a better society. right? We want a society where the government has as little distortion on the market as possible, while still recognizing that democracy is the worst form of government except all the others that we've been trying. And as a result, we've got to have some way to accommodate the public's interests. The public doesn't want unlicensed pilots, even if we might acknowledge that, you know, in practice, it probably doesn't make a whole lot of difference. But we still have to recognize that at the same time, we can't just wait for our ideal society to then address poverty. We've got to do all of these things as best we can at once to try and keep as free a society as we can here in the real world.
There's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah.
You said a lot. First, I just want like a yes or no.
Yeah.
We're going to have to just do yes or no from now on.
Like, after all you just said,
Yeah.
do you support negative income tax?
Yeah, as an improvement
Okay.
over what exists now.
Oh. In your ideal society, though, would it also exist? Because I think Spike also acknowledged, like, maybe that would be preferable to what we have now, but I don't see it.
If it were the case that Spike is correct, that in essence, I think you're saying this, that all poverty, in essence, if we didn't have the government in the way, poverty would kind of naturally go away, for the most part. Maybe not 100%, but most of it.
It's not that it would go away. It's that it would be reduced to an issue that could be handled through things like charity and mutual aid. There's I mean, if whether you're a religious believer or not, the poor are always going to be among us. It's how we treat them, and I mean, there's a lot to be said about treating them with dignity, even while they remain in poverty. But the idea is that a lot of the poverty is either being created, made worse, or turned into a generational thing instead of a transitory thing. And if we get rid of those intrusions on the market and on people's lives that create that, then you now have an issue that can be addressed through voluntary means.
Yeah, and if that is true, then I wouldn't support it if it were just a cash giveaway. Like, I don't support redistribution for the sake of redistribution.
Correct.
The point is to alleviate poverty, because I tend to think that basically societies that have huge amounts of poverty are politically unstable, and then we go from democracy to something worse. And therefore,
correct.
the less bad alternative to me is some form of transfer payments. That doesn't mean that I think they're morally just on their own, even necessarily. I think they're better than the alternatives, you know?
Okay, so I think we all agree that, I think everything you just said we all agree with. Like, poverty can have external effects on everyone else, and it's not only in their interest to help them, it's in our interest to help people who are in poverty as well.
There's a critical difference, I think, though.
Oh,
I don't believe people always act in what is perhaps their enlightened self-interest. I think there is also different kinds of self-interest. Perhaps it would be in everyone's self-interest to contribute the small amount that would be necessary to end poverty if we got rid of all these other restrictions. I think, though, it is also in your self-interest to, not pay for something that ultimately you benefit from, perhaps a very small amount. Why are you contributing a small amount to this? Through, I think that's why we have a system of taxation. I don't think it's particularly malicious. It's just that there are problems that it's difficult to convince people to raise money for voluntarily because they're diffuse and the impact is not so clear. Like, whatever you might think of some government programs, the impact on most people is often very diffuse. The cost is often very diffuse. And that becomes very difficult to say, let's do all of this voluntarily.
So I want to give an example to the counter of that, since we're in a debate. The idea of that the people are left to their own devices, there's not going to be enough of a demand or a initiative to help enough to deal with whatever the given problem is, and therefore we need some level of central planning and taxation. So right now, not far from here, in Lee County, Florida, they were hit the hardest by Hurricane Ian. I mean, it was disastrous. The island of Pine Island was largely destroyed. It barely exists. And you had a group called the United Cajun Navy, as well as many other volunteers, both locally and across the country, who were already ready to spring to action. And as soon as they were finding out through like Facebook groups that are in Pine Island and around the area, as soon as they knew that area of Lee County was the area they needed to go to, you had hundreds of thousands of people coming from across the country, where they were met by the Lee County Sheriff's Department and the Coast Guard telling them to turn around or they'd be arrested. So I actually don't agree with that premise. I think that people do want to help. We have hundreds of billions of dollars that are donated every year to charities and nonprofits. And the problem largely often becomes, if you talk to charities and nonprofits, and I say this as someone who recently started a nonprofit, their number one barrier is not getting in trouble with the government. because of all of the regulations and hurdles that have been put in place. So
But
no,
the
I
overall level
don't.
of redistribution from government is much higher than what happens through charity, right?
Well,
there is like a substantially large proportion.
There's a larger proportion, but it's not necessarily the competition with government. I think, frankly, many of these charities, if they thought the government was doing a good enough job, they wouldn't compete. They'd be happy about it. They're getting involved because there's a need for it. They want to help. And very often, their biggest opponent is the government. And it could be something as big as, essentially a police state stopping people from coming in and helping. It could be something as small as someone giving out sandwiches to homeless people at the park and being told that's illegal and being threatened with arrest, which is true in almost every major metro area in the United States. So no, I don't agree with that. I think that people do want to help. That government largely often acts to either make it harder for them or sometimes outright forbid them from doing it, and then uses that lack of help, that vacuum of help that they've created to say, see, this is why you need the government to get involved with the welfare state. That's my belief.
There's something to that, because I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's not even particularly hard to do to think about clear examples of where the government arbitrarily engages in that kind of. I don't know the specifics, so I'm not going to say it was 100% arbitrary,
Yeah.
but it sounds pretty like an arbitrary exercise of power that benefited nobody.
Yeah.
I think, though, there are two things I think about that. First of all, as I think I know you in your debate with Destiny, you were talking about, it's good to do things on the local level. I am inclined to agree as somebody who believes in federalism, but I have to say one of the things that I have been the most black-pilled on in the United States and American politics recently has been the ability of local government to follow to implement ideas that advance human freedom. It seems actually that local governments are, when it comes to the building of housing, the enforcement of laws, in some ways, especially if you don't talk about things like foreign policy, the local governments are the most avaricious and the most hostile to individual freedom of all. And in fact, sometimes, whether it be the South in the past or zoning today, you have to appeal to somebody, some official at some higher level. Please cancel out my neighbor who thinks they have a right to tell me what to build or what to do. You mentioned the feeding of homeless people, for example. I agree. Those are very odious laws. But the thing that makes them so tragic is these are not, as much as I wish they were, the result of faraway capitals making arbitrary decisions designed to hurt people. These are people who have just decided, as I think a lot of people who've discussed homelessness at local meetings might be able to attest, communities a lot of them don't like homeless people and will take draconian measures to keep them out, doing things like buying bus tickets to ship them off to another community.
Yep.
And while I don't support that, I do think, though, it is worth noting that when local people don't have legal processes to do things that they want to do, sometimes they will resort to illegal processes. And for example, in the United States, we, again, in the South, and as much as I hate to keep talking about my home region, in the South, lots of extra legal measures were used to implement things like segregation and various forms of repression, even when the state wasn't doing that sort of thing. So I think it is important to recognize that I think that people are typically want to do good, typically want to do the right thing. I do think it is important, though, to remember that people, when they get together in groups especially, often will find all kinds of justifications to do bad things. And we get, I think, as a neoliberal, as a liberal, in essence, I tend to think that one of the checks on that are good, healthy institutions. I don't think that government is always going to do bad. I think sometimes government is the recourse of the individual who's dealing with the quote-unquote mob who thinks that they've got a perfectly good reason to do bad. And I feel like if we don't have some check there, like you mentioned the hurricanes, I totally get that. I dealt with a hurricane in Southwest Florida a few years ago.
Yeah.
When I was a kid, we had the Cajun Navy come out to us, too. It's a great organization.
Yeah.
I also think, though, about, some of the infrastructure that is necessary to prevent these 100-year floods. I mean,
can you be specific about what you think the government should provide in terms of like hurricane relief?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't know enough about specifically hurricane relief to say everything, but I'm
We have
open
FEMA
to,
that subsidizes insurance.
Some of that. I don't
People
like
aren't
that.
exposed to the cost of
I don't like
building
that.
on the coast,
Yeah.
and then they build things that fall apart because they don't have to worry about the insurance
I agree.
motivating them.
Yeah, I don't like the flood insurance program, though, of course, like a good libertarian, I take advantage of all government programs where they are available, to be clear. So I use the flood insurance program, but it should be canceled. All right, to be
Malicious
clear.
Just like I'll
Agorism.
take the student debt relief, too.
Exactly.
Yes.
Right.
It's
I
wrong,
remember
but
the story
I'll take
about
$10,000.
Ayn
Chaotic-
Rand taking the
chaotic
benefits,
good
and
agorism, yes.
they try and shame for it. No. I mean, you paid for it, but. That said, I don't like a lot of that stuff. I do think, though, with other things, like when we talk about infrastructure that helps control floods and makes vast tracts of land that might not otherwise be useful. I mean, these are things that do have a serious impact on making our country safer, in which themselves, that can bring down costs too. And those are, I think that's hard to do stuff like that purely voluntarily. You know, build a dam through purely voluntarily means. I mean, it's tough. It doesn't happen that often.
You know, there's so much more I wanted to discuss. Because I wanted to ask you about just the government's capability to do everything that Bastia is so optimistic about.
Oh, that's easy.
But-
They can't. Go ahead.
And I think that is actually, like, there is like an optimism on this side.
I share the skepticism. I think, though, it's important to recognize, as I think the folks I was talking about, Friedman and Hayek, do, that, yeah, there are things that government is worse at and things I think that government is better at. There are functions that, by their very nature, are just a little different. For example, the government making sandwiches would be it's a disaster because this is a market that's already satisfied. People can already make products. They don't need to do, the government doing that would distort competition. On the other hand, when it comes to, say, national defense, having multiple providers could be a problem.
On that note, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.